All right, well, I passed out, Melinda told me the other day, it sure would help if we just had copies of the maps. So I finally found maps that look halfway decent in black and white because color copies are expensive. So I made maps for you just to kind of see graphically how each empire grew over time. And so the first map you see, there are 3 different pages. I've got some more here. No. Okay, it's a set of maps, 3 different pages, 5 different maps. The first map is the Assyrian Empire, and you'll see the second map, there's the bottom of the page, is the Babylonian Empire, and that looks very, very, very similar. Then you go to the second page, that's the Persian Empire, I believe, am I right? Yes, Persian Empire. And you can see on the Persian Empire how it's grown, how it's expanded to the east and to the west. And then we haven't talked yet about it, but there's the Greek Empire, and then the fifth map, the third page, is the Roman Empire. So as we progress through the class, we're going to discuss the growth of these empires and the Hebrew circumstances within the scope of each empire. So that's just to help you visually and contextually understand what we're talking about and how when I kept saying that Jerusalem and Judea was sandwiched between the 2 larger empires, the 2 larger powers, you can kind of see visually how that plays out. And also when I talked last week about, I think it was last week, it may have been 2 weeks ago, about Palestine being kind of the crisscross of the nations. And you can kind of visually see how it is a really key spot for travel routes from east to west, northeast to southwest, northwest to southeast, that sort of thing. So kind of just gives you a little more context visually of the geographic area we're talking about.
Where's Palestine on the map?
Okay,
I'm not seeing it.
if you see the Mediterranean Sea, okay, that's going to be darker color, I believe. Okay, now on the right-hand side of the Mediterranean, you'll see a land where the land starts. And remember my little squiggles? The Dead Sea is the little bitty lake that's the larger of the little bitty lakes that you see to the right of the Mediterranean Sea. And just north of that is an even smaller lake. That's Galilee. Now, from Galilee to the bottom of the Dead Sea is the scope of Israel. So you can see how small a land we're talking about when we talk about Israel in context of the larger empires that were around them. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought it was just the label Palestine. I wasn't seeing the label.
Yeah. Sorry. No, it's little bitty in context to the rest of the world. And so you can see when it gets to Rome and they talk about the entire Roman world, in their mind that was the entire world. I mean, it was such a huge, vast scope of land, a scope of geography, that to them that was the entire world because it was so far-reaching from their small context. Okay, I'm going to back up just a little bit because there's one other thing that I know we really ought to talk about before we move on into the Grecian Empire, and that's this little word that we read in the New Testament. We talked about synagogues, right? Who has heard the word Sanhedrin? You know the word Sanhedrin. What is the Sanhedrin from what we understand in the New Testament? The governing body, okay? In what way? How did they govern, and who did they govern? That's absolutely correct, but let's extend that. The Jews, okay? How did they become the governing body of the Jews? Oh, that's what we want to go back and try to capture, because we need that as context as we go through, and all of a sudden Jesus is getting tried by the Sanhedrin, and we're like, well, wait a minute, where did these people come from? How did they get the power to do this in the first place? Okay, remember when we started way back, we started with King Saul. In the days of the kings, who was the governing body? The rulers, the kings. Okay? Let's see, my brain just went this direction, but the rest of it went this direction. So let me try to pull that back together and see where I was going. What you often saw was, you've heard the phrase, the king sat at the gate of the city. The king would hold court at the gate of the city, and people brought their problems, their civic needs and questions and cases to the king at the gate of the city. And so when we see, for instance, when Absalom was trying to get in good with the people, he and his dad King David weren't seeing eye to eye. And so Absalom ended up sitting at the seat of the gate, and he would help people resolve their problems. And he was building up favor with the people as he would judge their cases at the gate of the city. And so that was generally the place. When you had a kingship or a ruler, that was the context or the kind of thing that you saw. When the people became captives in Babylon, what happened to the kingship? Fizzled. Okay? In fact, when Zerubbabel was the last of the line of David, and he was the one who brought a cohort of the Jews back to Jerusalem. But when he died, basically David's kingship lineage died with him. Okay? So the people had to find a different way to govern themselves. Now, one of the ways that they did that was through the priests and the alternate council or judging body. Tradition has it that Ezra set up, remember he set up the synagogues. Well, there was a synagogue in Jerusalem called the Great Synagogue. And that as this was set up, it was not only religious, but it was also more of a civic place as well. The Great Synagogue went about some of the business of playing supreme court for the people. Now, over time, it wasn't called a Sanhedrin to start with. Sanhedrin is actually, the word was used in Persia, or the idea was used in Persia, but the word that comes from Greek, let me figure out what I'm saying here. Find the document. Oh, look, it's behind me. It's from the word synhedra. Syn means together with, and hedra means seat, so seated together. So this ruling body was a group of people that were seated together to judge in what we would call a judicial kind of system, a corporate kind of system. In the Great Sanhedrin, or the Great Council, and this is true today, well, we know this to be fact today, and we believe it was true at that time. There were 70 people who made up the Great Council, or the Great Sanhedrin. Now, there were other outskirt judging bodies, sometimes called Sanhedrins, but they were smaller Sanhedrins, or not even then, but just judges that they were called. But you had 70 in Jerusalem, and then you had 23 sometimes in a town that had 120 families. You could have a Sanhedrin of 23 people, 23 judges. If it was a smaller town, smaller than 120 families, you either had a group of 7 or a group of 3 judges. Now, we believe that Ezra set that up. We really don't have, I haven't found, let me just say, I haven't found a place where I can put my finger and say, absolutely, this is how he did it, this is when he did it. But we believe that Ezra was the one who set that up. However, let me take you to a couple passages. There's my Bible, way over here. Good thing to bring to class, a Bible. Let me take you to a couple passages. Let me go backwards just a little bit to the time of the kings. But this is not the beginning of the kings. This is not the end of the kings. This is a king kind of right in the middle, King Jehoshaphat. King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles, we see, now King Jehoshaphat was one of the more good kings in the southern kingdom. Okay? He did mostly right in the eyes of the Lord. He did some pretty stupid things too, but he was a good one. And he tried to clean up house. And here's what it says in 2 Chronicles 19, starting in verse 4. Jehoshaphat lived in Jerusalem, and he went out again among the people from Bathsheba to the hill country of Ephraim, and turned them back to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. Now, he appointed judges in the land, in each of the fortified cities of Judah. He told them, carefully consider what you do, because you are not judging for mere mortals, but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Now, let the fear of the Lord be on you. Judge carefully, for with the Lord our God there is no injustice or partiality or bribery. So he set judges in the outer regions of Judea. In Jerusalem, it says, verse 8, also Jehoshaphat appointed some of the Levites, priests, and head of Israelite families to administer the law of the Lord and to settle disputes. And they lived in Jerusalem. So here we see King Jehoshaphat setting up what could be construed as a Sanhedrin or a great council or a judicial body in Jerusalem to administer justice as like a Supreme Court would. And it's the same style that we see in the New Testament, now called the Sanhedrin. Now, did I mention? Yes, I mentioned that there are 70 people that sit in the Sanhedrin. 71 or 2, depending on whether you count the leaders of the Sanhedrin. Let's go all the way back now to Moses. Because in the Jewish tradition, the concept of the Sanhedrin really dates back to Moses. So let's just take a journey back. In my book, it's about half an inch. We're going to go to Numbers. And let's see. Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 16. Now remember, Moses was leading this large group of Israelites. He was the leader. And he was getting overwhelmed with all of the judicial responsibilities. All the civic thing. My brother did this to me. My neighbor did. He's like, hey, God, I didn't ask for this job. If you read just before that in chapter 11. He's like, wait a minute. This isn't what I bargained for. And so the Lord said to Moses in verse 16, bring me 70. 70 sounds familiar, right? Bring me 70 of Israel's elders who are known to you as leaders and officials among the people. Have them come to the tent of meeting that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take some of the power of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. They will share the burden of the people with you so that you will not have to carry it alone. Okay, so these 70 with the early Israelites helped out in the judicial fashion. Okay, so in the Jewish mind, the Sanhedrin, the concept of a Sanhedrin dates all the way back to Moses. So it's not a stretch when Ezra is coming back from the captivity and he's reinvigorating religiousness or religiosity or religious conviction in the Israelites. It's not a stretch to say, hey, Moses, God told Moses set up 70 people to help with the council, help with the judging, help with the administration of civic duties across the country. So it's not a stretch to say that they implemented that as well. Now, what we will see is that body is formalized over time, and it is politically influenced over time. At the time of Ezra, it's Levites, priests, heads of families in a way that are respected elders of the community. But what we see in the Grecian and Hasmonean empires, that's a word I probably haven't thrown out to you yet, is that they were politically influenced, and they themselves became influential politically. So I want to get that kind of stirring in your head, because we will talk about it again as we progress through this silent 400-year intertestament period, but we will better understand its context when we read about it then in Matthew. Okay, pondered that long enough. Let's go to Greece. Okay, what we finished with last week was the Persian Empire, and we talked about some of the writers, the biblical writers that wrote during this time. Daniel wrote both in the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire. Who else wrote during the Persian Empire time? Ezra, Nehemiah. Okay, and a lot of times people think that Ezra and Nehemiah was written by the same person, probably Ezra, but there are scholars that think no, they were truly written by Ezra and Nehemiah separately. But I will say, in the Jewish, I'm just going to say the Jewish Bible, that's very generic, but in the Jewish Bible they look at it as one book, Ezra and Nehemiah, as one book. Esther was also written during this time. Okay, what about prophets? Did any prophets write during this time? Haggai and Zechariah. You know this because you're reading the notes, aren't you? I love it. That's great. That's great. Haggai and Zechariah. In fact, Haggai and Zechariah were the prophets that came back into town when they had returned to Jerusalem and kind of sort of dabbled at rebuilding the temple, but then they got really concerned about building their own houses and trying to live within the new context, that they left the temple incomplete. And Haggai and Zechariah came back in and said, hey, the time is now to rebuild the temple. And so they fit right in this area, and they helped the motivation to get the temple completed. Okay? There was one other that we know of at the very end, Malachi. Malachi is generally listed as the last Old Testament writer to have written, and he wrote during this period of the Persian Empire. Okay, right at the end of, let's see, 4th century. So right around, the beginning of the 4th century, right around 390-ish, I believe, BC, is when we believe Malachi wrote. Okay, so that leaves 400 years. If he wrote around 390 BC, and we pick up again somewhere close to 0 in the New Testament, we now have 400 years that we have to cover in context before we really understand where we are when we get to the New Testament. So what happens in those 400 years? Well, Persia is the big empire right now, and you've got a map of that. And they are actually truly a big empire. When you look at the size of Babylon compared to the size of Persia, you see that the scope of land has actually grown quite a bit. Cyrus was very good at conquering people. He was also very good. Remember, one of the reasons that Persia got so big is they allowed people to live as the people wanted to live. They didn't force their culture on their captives. And so that's one of the rationale for Cyrus letting people go back to Jerusalem. Okay? We don't need you to live as we live. We just want your money. Okay? We just want you to acknowledge us as your conqueror or as your kingdom lordship. You can go ahead and live as you live. And so they were able to expand their kingdom And people weren't quite as frustrated with them because of that. Except for the fact that they kept trying to push farther out and push farther out. Now, where they had problems, King Darius III, and that's like if you know all the kings, that's way down here. He tried to go conquer Macedon and Greece. Macedon is just north of Greece. So Greece and Macedon, way over there, close to Rome. Okay? He kept trying to push farther east. Now, Greece didn't like that much. Macedonia didn't like that much. And they themselves had a fairly decent army and a pretty darn good commander by the name of Philip of Macedon. Now, Egypt was actually getting a little bit perturbed as well. Egypt always wants to be independent, right? And it's really hard to make sure you got Egypt because it's a long ways down there. Well, Egypt had actually formed a little bit of an alliance with Greece. And so what happens is in the reign of Darius III, they try to conquer Greece and Macedon, and Philip was able to repulse them. He was able to keep them from growing that direction. Now, as they grew, though, there was, I'm just going to call them some outer territories that were part of the Macedonian culture that Persia had conquered. So you had people living in the Greek culture, but now in the Persian Empire. They didn't like that so much. And so Greece and Macedonia were very interested in recapturing those peoples, recapturing that land for those peoples. And so there was this one little territory that kept going back and forth and getting frustrated between these two large powers. And what happened was Philip of Macedon got strong enough and he was able to repulse the Persian Empire. But in the fray, somehow, people believe that the Persians came across and killed Philip. Not in war, not in battle, but just killed him in his civilian life. Now, Philip had a son, a younger son, teenage son. His name was Alexander. Alexander, it's been said, did not show a whole lot of military promise. He was a bookworm. Do what? Okay. He was a bookworm. And so Philip, his dad, says, okay, I can handle that. I'm going to find you the finest tutor I can. Who do you think tutored Alexander? Okay, let me start backwards. Let's go backwards just a couple. And let's start with a man named Socrates. Now, who did Socrates teach? Plato. Okay? Plato then taught someone else. Do you know who that was? Aristotle. These are names we know, aren't it? But it's different context. We don't think of these names in conjunction with the Bible, do we? No. Right. So, these are Greek philosophers. Yes, Greek philosophers. And they wrote mythology, some of them. But they were really more about thinking about practical living and morals. So we have Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander. Okay, so that's key when we see after the Grecian Empire grows and Greek thought is promoted. Okay? Alexander was very interested in promoting Greek thought across the entire world. Now, you've got this young fella.
Now, when you say Greek thought, are philosophy and this, you know.
Yes. Yes. In many ways, thought and culture go together because thought drives culture. It's kind of like Hollywood philosophy and how Hollywood philosophy then affects American culture. Okay? Now, does it in every possible way affect American culture? No. But generally, there is an effect on American culture because of Hollywood philosophy. Okay? So Greek thought is just a way of thinking, a way of acting, a way of being, and along with that comes their religion. Okay? The devotional experience of Greece. Well, when Philip gets murdered, because it didn't happen in war, if I'm remembering right. Could be wrong about that, but I think it didn't happen in war. Philip decides, everyone thinks the Persians did. I'm going to pick up the baton, I'm going to pick up the flag, and I'm going to continue this fight. Now, even though Philip did not think that Alexander was much of a military person, Alexander showed some great military prowess. He was horrible when it came to sea, when it came to water. But as a land tactician, he was superb. And some of that may be due to his thinking skills. Okay? But he was about 19 years old, 18, 19, when his father died, and he became king of this new region. Okay? This new region was Macedon. He was not a Greek, he was a Macedonian, but they were of the Greek culture. Okay, they had conquered Greece and had been exposed to and accepted Greek culture. So what we see then, in a very, very, very swift way, Alexander takes about 40,000 men and starts sweeping to the west. He chases down Darius, he kills Darius, he makes alliances with Egypt, he goes down into Egypt, he conquers Egypt, and a lot of it was, Egypt was already ready to open its doors. Okay? It was already sick of the Persian rule, and so basically they were saying, come on in. So it was a swift overtaking, partly because it was a welcome overtaking. While he's down there, Alexander learns about being Pharaoh, and he kind of likes that idea, so he takes on the name of Pharaoh as well. Okay, so now we have Alexander the Great being the king of his empire, but also Pharaoh. He also sets up a town. Does anyone remember the name of that town? In Egypt. Alexandria. And aren't we oh so thankful that he did that? Because Alexandria was a center of thought for years to come. And Alexandria kept an enormous library of thought from across the globe. So it was an awesome thing that happened there. But as Alexander swept through, part of the reason it happened so quickly was he came through and he said, okay, you can either acknowledge me as your king and pay taxes to us, or we will totally obliterate your city, everyone living in it, and pour salt on the ground. When you pour salt on the ground, nothing grows. The few towns who rebelled, got obliterated, became object lessons for the rest. And so that didn't happen very much. There is a story about Alexander taking Tyre. Do you remember Tyre, the city of Tyre? Tyre was just north of Israel, on the coastline. It was a big marine country. They established great seaports and great ships, and they were the first to acknowledge King David as king of his own independent empire. Okay? And they united with David and Solomon. Solomon joined up with Tyre, and they sent ships around to China to bring back goods from Asia. Okay, so Tyre was very important in 500, 600 years ago. Well, Tyre, part of Tyre, the central city part of Tyre, was out on an island in the Mediterranean. At least I'm told this. I've never seen it with my own eyes. But they said, how are you going to come conquer us? Remember, he's not very good on water. Great on land, but not very good on water. So Alexander spends the night thinking, walking back and forth thinking. Well, he's got 35,000, 40,000 men. So what he decides to do, this whole land has tons of rocks. There's lots of rocks in this land. So he says, okay, everybody pick up a rock. And he builds a causeway across to the land, to this island of Tyre. And then they can march across, and using land tactical maneuvers, they take Tyre. And I'm told that you can still see parts of that causeway today under the water. That's pretty cool to me. I kind of like that. It's a neat little story. There are other stories about Alexander the Great that are probably as engaging, but I'll save you a little bit of that and move on. Alexander made a huge sweep across, did not really expand the empire very much. If you look at your map, the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire look very similar in size. Okay? So really it was a change of hands more than anything. He got all the way to India, and his soldiers said, we are not going any farther. We didn't sign up for this. We're just not going any farther. So disappointed, he turned back and sent some of them home in a ship, but he actually made a lot of them march back home. But he went back to Babylon. Probably we're thinking he was going to make Babylon the center of his kingdom. Well, he got ill. He actually got wounded in a fight. That's another story that I actually probably don't need to bring to you. But he got wounded in a fight. It's kind of a funny story. And from his wounds and from other illness, he got really sick in Babylon and died when he was 33 years old. Okay, so he was king. Remember, he became king about age 19, and he died at 33, so very young. His brother-in-law, I think it was, back in Macedon, took up the kingship of Macedon, but he didn't leave anyone behind to actually become king of the empire. And so some stories say he actually said, give it to the strong. The strong were 4 of his military generals. There were 4 generals, and most of what I've seen, they actually spent about the next 20 years duking it out, trying to divvy out who was going to get the land. And so what they ended up doing was dividing the empire kind of like just kind of in quadrants. And this is how they divided it. Let me get their names. Let's see. Make sure. Oh, wow. Okay. I want to say Lysimachus. Oh, here it is. Lysimachus was one of the generals, and he got Asia Minor. Asia Minor is the area of Turkey and reaching over to Macedon. Cassander actually gets Greece and Macedon, and I don't know how that plays out with Alexander's brother-in-law, who was back in the homeland. But the 2 that we really care about in our conversation, Ptolemy gets the area of Egypt, and Seleucus gets Syria and Asia. Okay, I know those names. What we see for the next little bit is Ptolemy and Seleucus, here we go again, start fighting each other over that middle land. And who lives in the middle? Israel, the Jews. Okay, So we see it go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and little skirmishes all throughout. Let's see, where do we want to go? I've got a note here, but okay, because I want to spend a lot of time on the Seleucids, I think I'm going to not really go that direction today. We're going to talk about the Ptolemies. Ptolemy, I had just said, took control of Egypt. Now, Ptolemy was a lot more gracious to the Jews. Now, remember, we actually have a Jewish cohort living in Egypt, don't we? Why do we have a Jewish cohort already living in Egypt? Jeremiah. Yeah, remember when the temple was destroyed and Babylon took over? Some of them did not go to Babylon. Some of them hightailed it to Egypt, and they carried Jeremiah with them. So we already had some Jews living in Egypt. Well, they've been living there for a long time, and they've been developing their lifestyle, their Jewish lifestyle in the land. And one of the Ptolemies, and remember we have Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria, one of the Ptolemies wanted to have the Jewish scriptures in the Library of Alexandria. And so he hires some Jewish scholars to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Remember, this is the Grecian Empire. We're speaking Greek. Now, I about said legend, but I'm going to say tradition has it. I would lean on legend, but that's my personal opinion. Tradition has it that he put 70 scholars, 72 actually, but 70 scholars in different rooms, each of them translating the Torah, and each of them translated it exactly the same way to every jot and tittle. Jot and tittle are little Grecian characters. And thus we can be assured that this new Greek translation is accurate. Again, that's tradition. I almost chalk it up to legend. But what we have when they finish this compilation is called the Septuagint. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, they started with the Torah, and that's what we know that they did in these rooms, these special circumstance. But then over time, all of the other Hebrew books were added to it. Okay? And so what we have is the Hebrew Scriptures translated into the Greek-speaking language. As the Greeks took over, not only did they bring their culture, but they brought their language. And what we see in the New Testament, remember, we started out Hebrew, and then we had Aramaic, and a lot of the common people were speaking Aramaic at the time, but we see an influx in Greek-speaking people, Grecian culture. We have people who changed their Hebrew name to Greek names. Give me an example. How about Saul? Changed to Paul. Okay? So it depends on who you're talking to or who you're trying to maybe convert, who your audience is. You want to portray yourself in the context of their culture. And so Paul, who was going to the Greek-speaking world, did not become known as Paul. He became known as Saul. He became known as Paul. Saul was Hebrew. Paul was a Greek form of his name. Okay? Jacob was changed to Israel. God changed that a long time ago. That was not because of Greek reasons, but yes, there are lots of people in the Bible who actually had name changes for various reasons. And some people changed their own name, and some people, God changed it for them. In fact, Jesus said, you will no longer be called Simon, you'll be called Peter. Okay? That's not because of Grecian so much, although Peter is more of a Greek name, but that has a nuance in its meaning, its foundational meaning. Rock. I'll just say rock. I won't go into that whole theology there, but I'll just say rock. Okay. So we have this new Bible, Old Testament Bible, called the Septuagint. And if you see this written anywhere, this is often referred to as the LXX. Why would that be? It means 70 in Roman numerals. 70 represents the 70 scholars that translated this document. 70 seems to be the number of the day. I feel like Sesame Street now. Today's number is 70. Yes, that's right. But 70 scholars, 72 actually is what we believe were the number of scholars, but it's rounded to 70. So if you see that, that's what that means. It means the Greek translation of the Hebrew Testament. Now, that is likely the documents that the common people in the New Testament would have read. Okay? It is not necessarily the documents that were read during the synagogue meetings, because they had the Hebrew scrolls. Okay? But if Peter was going to know about what the book of Isaiah said, he might have gotten it from the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew readings. Yes, he would have gotten some from the Hebrew readings, but this was in the common language of the day by the time we get to the New Testament. And so a lot of that was referenced in that time.
Well, the Hebrew was called the Torah. The Septuagint was the translation of the Torah.
The Torah, we don't have time. Let's talk about that next week. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Septuagint actually covers the whole of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, which includes the Torah, but there are 2 other sections of the Hebrew Scriptures that it also includes. The Torah we know of as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those were the primary, the fundamental, the laws of God. So that's what was translated first for the Septuagint. But then over time, the other was added to it. And let's talk about that next week. It's a good place to pick up. I feel like today I was a little scattered, but there's just so much information in this time to cover, and it's hard to put it in some consecutive way. But let's talk about the different components of the Hebrew Scriptures next week. We'll pick up again with the Septuagint. And what we want to do is work ourselves out of Egypt, because Egypt kind of takes care of itself. These people are kind of independent. From this time on, they kind of live a good life down there. But in Palestine, we have problems. And we're going to deal with Palestine next week and how Palestine lives within the Seleucid Empire. Remember, Seleucus was that general that got control of Syria and Asia. The Seleucid Empire gives us trouble. So we're going to talk about that interaction next week. All right, let's pray right quick and we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you so much for history. Thank you for giving us some insight into the context of your word. And help us to apply that context appropriately, that we may read your word and understand it in ways that we can glean not only what happened and why it happened, but also apply it in the appropriate ways in our own lives. Thank you for your people. Thank you for the freedom we have to worship you and to study your word. And help us, Lord, to make the most of that freedom. Help us as we continue through this next week and bring us together again safely. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.